Great to see you here again. My name is Luc de Custer, founder of the Custer Academy. And in this video, I'm going to talk about project duration reduction methods. We've been calculating the duration of a project, but we still have to ask the question, what can we do with this duration? Will our customer be happy? Are there other possibilities? And we have to look deeper in how can we reduce the duration of a project. Now, before we continue, don't forget to click on the subscribe button, click on the bell button, and every time we have a new video, YouTube will inform you about it. Now, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why do we want to reduce the duration of a project? Now, when we calculate our project, we find the duration based on the estimate that we have. And based on those estimates, we will find a completion time, a probable completion time. But is this time sufficient, or do we have less time? Do we have more time? We have to look at this. Now, when we want to reduce duration, it probably means that the duration that we have available to complete the project is less than the time we have calculated in our planning, during our planning. Now, what we have to do also is that we have to verify what is happening. Can we do the project in the time that the customer requested? Because there may be some fines when the project takes longer. Now, when we finish the project faster, we may have some rewards, some bonuses. And all these things we have to consider what is going on. What can we do? Is it interesting to reduce the duration? Do we have to reduce the duration because we want to avoid fines? Or will we reduce the duration because we can reduce the total cost and in some cases even get some additional bonuses? Another parameter is when we look at the level of effort cost of the project. We have a level of effort cost which is typically the project management. Project management is always on time. We start at the beginning of the project, we finish at the end of the project. Now it is clear that when we reduce the duration of the project management costs, expenses will also be less. So there are different ways to look at this. Reducing the duration can be interesting because we can save money, but it can also be necessary to avoid fines or to take advantage of some rewards and bonuses. Now, what are the methods that we can use for duration reduction? There are different methods that exist. We already spoken about activity crashing. So we add more activities to critical path activities. So basically what we're going to do, some activities will be completed faster. Since they're on the critical path, it will also have an effect of the duration of the project. Another way to deal with duration reduction is fast tracking. And here we will be executing activities in parallel. So those are the main methods that we have considered before, but we can also look at adjusting resources allocations. We can look at adjusting dependencies between activities. We can increase the project budget so that we don't really need to do the duration reduction. We can reduce the project scope or split a project into different phases. So these are different methods that we can use to take into account that we have a problem with the duration of the project, and there are some activities that we can do. Now, in this video, we will only talk about, or mostly talk about, activity crashing and fast tracking. Now, again, something about the importance about duration reduction. Now, one of the elements that we can also have to consider or could consider is the time sensitivity of the project. Now, what happens if it takes longer to complete a project? It will also be later that we will be having revenues from the project. We may have additional costs. And of course, since we have a reduced period that we can recuperate the cost, we also may have problems related to profitability. All these elements have to be considered when we're evaluating the duration of the project. We have to wonder what will happen if the project would take too long. We can consider a loss of reputation, and in the world of project management, reputation may be one of your main assets to give you, in fact, additional customers. We can have fines. We can have additional cost of resources because the project is taking longer. We have to see that the people stay with the project longer than expected. And we can also evaluate a reduced income after project completion. Now, when we look at activity crashing, this is a way to, let's say, to deal with the project duration reduction. We can calculate the efficiency of crashing on the project. What will crashing help us, and how will it be profitable or advantageous for the project? Now, when we look at activity crashing, we have to look at two ways to deal with crashing. First of all, we have to look at the relationship between cost and duration as a tool for project negotiation. So when we are calculating the duration of the project and we are applying crashing, we can find a relationship between the time, the duration of the project, and the cost of the project. And we will look at an example where we have done this, and we can use that later when we are discussing with our customer, and the customer says we want to have the project finished in a specific time. So we can evaluate what our cost would be in that case, and we can adjust our price offering taking these elements into account. Another element to look at activity crashing is in fact the optimization of the cost of the project by reducing or even eliminating fines, reducing project management cost or other level of effort cost, and in some cases even to take advantage of rewards. So these are the things that we can find out when we are going to do some activity crashing, and we can identify what is the most optimal solution, what is the optimal duration in our case. When we look at the principle of activity crashing, we are going to reduce the duration of the project by adding more resources to activities. Adding more resources to activities means that we may encounter what we call the crash point. Now, we have to consider two conditions before we want to apply activity crashing. Now, adding more resources will reduce the duration on the activity only when we have resource dependent activities. When we have fixed duration activities, adding more people to the activity will not reduce its duration. The second thing we have to consider is that the activity or the activities we want to crash, they have to be on the critical path. If we crash activities that are not on the critical path, we will see that the project duration will not change, and the only thing we are doing is creating extra slack and extra cost, but we will not reduce the duration. So these are things that we have to take into account when we will be looking at activity crashing. Now, there are some limitations. We see here the crash point. The crash point, when we are left of the crash point, we see that we still have reduction of the duration by adding more resources. But after the crash point, due to interference between the people, we see that basically the duration will start to increase. And that's not really what we want to have. We have to look here, do we want 4 or 5 people? Well, we see with 5 people, we still reduce the duration. So if duration is important, we would consider in this case to add 5 people, but the cost will be higher. When we have, in fact, a cost-related issue, we can say that 4 people will be cheaper to complete this activity. So these are things that we have to take into consideration. When we look at the relationship between time and cost, we can see here that we have, in fact, the time and the activity cost. We have, in this case, an activity with a normal duration of 6 periods, and the cost of that activity is then 35K. We can crash it up to 2 periods, but then the cost increases with 55 up to 55K. Basically, it increases with 20K. Now, we consider that the evolution for simplification over this period is linear. So we can calculate the activity or the crash cost per period, which is the difference of the crash cost and normal cost divided by the time change. In this case, we would find 20K we will have as extra cost over 4 periods. So the crash cost per period will be 5K. Now, when we look at this, we can use this for the basic calculations, and we can find, for example, what I said, the time cost relationship. We have a time and cost for the initial project without crashing, and the initial cost, C0. Then we crash, and we see, depending on the crashing, we see that the time is being reduced, but the cost is increasing. And from a certain element here at the end, we continue crashing, but we see we crash. The cost increases because we are crashing more activities, but the duration is not changing anymore. So we have to see here what are the optimal possibilities that we have. And depending on the time that our customer wants us to complete the project, we can estimate what the cost would be. We can also look at what we call the total project cost function. We have the direct cost, the cost to complete the activities. Then we have the PM cost, project management cost, which is a level of effort cost, and we see that it's a linear increase over time. We also have the penalties, which start from a certain duration, and we also find the rewards, and the rewards which are in fact bonuses once the duration is less than a certain number. The line that we find, the yellow line, is in fact giving us the overview of the total cost, and the total cost is the sum of all those costs together, of course minus the rewards because it's a positive effect, and we can find what is the duration, the optimal duration where we have the minimum cost for the project. So these are all the parameters that we have to combine and that we have to look into. The other element what we were looking at is what we call fast tracking. Now here we will not reduce the duration of the activities, but we will change the follow-up relationship. And when we look at the different dependencies that we defined before, there was also the percentage complete dependency. So it means that we are starting a follow-up activity once the predecessor task has been completed for a certain percentage. Now, we will start the activity or the successor activity earlier than when the predecessor is finished, and we can change these start times. But what we see is that we will be doing activities in parallel, and these activities that are done in parallel will in fact or can have an effect on each other because there may be interference which will have an effect on the duration of those activities. So when you're doing tasks in parallel, it will have an effect, not in all cases, but in most cases, it will have an effect on the duration of those activities. Nevertheless, completing those activities in parallel will finally have a positive effect on the completion of the project. When we look at fast tracking, we can, let's say, have that effect of increased activity, duration, and cost. Because we are combining those activities, we see that there may be some additional work that we have to do in order to be able to do those activities in parallel. Another element here is that we may introduce some risks because we are not using best practice principles. We are not using those best practices. Now, it's also very important when we look at fast tracking that we apply this on critical path activities. If we don't reduce the critical path or we use fast tracking on activities which are not on the critical path, then we will not have the desired effect. And it is very important to identify the changes in the critical path when we apply fast tracking. The same thing like when we do activity crashing, we may have effects on the critical path, and we have to be sure that the critical path we have been considering is still the critical path when we apply fast tracking or crashing. We also have to make a distinction between mandatory and discretionary precedences. Now, when we look at mandatory relationships, we cannot change the relationship because there are physical restrictions. You cannot plant a tree before digging a hole. So you have to understand these requirements. Is there a mandatory precedence relationship, yes or no? When we have discretionary precedence relationships, typically we are ordering the activities taking into account best practices. And we can do these differently, but we have to be careful. If we don't use best practices, it may have an effect on the final project. Now, effect of fast tracking on the project. Let's have a look. Here we have 5 activities. Let's say this is the critical part, and we do these activities. First activity A, then B, C, D, and then E. So we find the original duration of the project, and what we're going to do now is to put those activities A, B, C, and D, let's say in parallel. They're going to start earlier than originally planned. Now, these are activities in parallel. I made them a little bit longer to include the effect of the fact that they may interfere with each other. And then we have activity E, which is just completed or starts after activity D. And we see that there is an effect that the project is completed faster. So we have a reduced duration, and this is basically the time we saved by fast tracking these activities. So that was it on the chapter of reduction of duration of projects. Anyway, don't forget to click on the subscribe button, click on the bell button, and every time we have a new video, YouTube will inform you about it. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.